big welcome to everyone on the call. We have today a session with Quartz Counselling. You will meet both Kathryn and Barbara very shortly, and they'll introduce themselves and then rattle through this really hot topic. Anyone that has questions, please pop them in either the Q&A or the chat box. I'll be managing that so that Barbara and Kathryn can focus on the delivery of the content, and then we'll come to any of those, whether they've come in through the session or at the end. I'll also be managing the PowerPoint for Kathryn and Barbara, so do excuse us kind of saying, next slide, back one, etc., etc. But as I say, the PowerPoint and today's session is being recorded. We'll share with you some materials as well as feedback afterwards, but I hope it's a rich session for everyone and that you get a lot from it. So without further ado, I will turn off my camera and pass over to Kathryn or Barbara. Don't know who's going first, but thanks so much.
Thank you, Hayley. That would be me. Hi, everyone. If we could just go on to the first kind of substantive slide, that would be great. Hayley, please, thanks. So just as a quick introduction, so I know that we don't have much time. This is us. We're going to not be on camera for the body of the talk, and then perhaps on the Q&A we can jump on, but this is us. So I'm down there at the bottom, Kathryn Finch. I'm General Counsel of QCPT and founder of QCC, which is our EDI coaching consulting. Barbara, far more important, is the founder of QCPT, which stands for Quartz, Counselling, Psychotherapy and Training Limited. She is you can see on the screen, a counsellor, psychotherapist, clinical a supervisor and a trainer with a lot of experience. So together we're coming to talk to you about a very exciting topic, and one that we both hold very close to our hearts, which is identity and EDI in mental health provision. So next slide, please. So just quickly, I thought it would be useful for me to take us through the session goals. We will be talking in both the broad and the specific, because I think, and Barbara agrees with me, that it's very important. So firstly, we're going to go over the context. So in a topic like identity and EDI, it's very important to get that context, understand the history, how we've ended up where we are, clarifying the contemporary issues leading on from that. So how we've gotten here and where we are, and then how to improve. And that's, the bit that everybody wants to jump to. So next slide, please. So before we start, I kind of skipped over my intro, but I am general counsel. I'm a trained lawyer, and as such, I can't resist putting in a few kind of health warnings before we start. None of this is legal advice, obviously, but I feel I would be remiss if I didn't recognise the broadness of the audience and point out some other sort of homework for you to go away and look at if you haven't already. You probably have. But EDI, diversity, equality, have a lot of legal implications. So depending on the characterisation of the organisation, everybody has an equality duty. It's law. And if you're doing public sector work, then you have the additional public sector duty. Mental health provision does usually come under that. So it's important to look into who you're working with, how you're working, what you're classified as, etc. The impact of EDI, this is a more general point and probably more organisation focused. I think there is a temptation to think of EDI thought, discussion and implementation as a lovely optional extra. This is not the case. Even in non-helping professions, EDI is very, very important, and it has been proved time and time again that a focus and a qualitative approach to EDI really does help both individuals and also organisations as a whole be more successful. During this workshop, we will be talking about interpersonal and systemic issues. We're going to be focusing, because of the nature of our discussion, on interpersonal, and so we'll see how we're doing for time, whether we get to the systematic. But I just wanted to highlight, and I'll go into that more when we're talking about context, that EDI is both a broad and a very specific topic. It's broad in that it relates to almost every single thing that we do, the way we go to school, go to work, do everything, but also it really, really is relevant to who we are as people and how we relate to everybody around us in both a professional and personal capacity. So we're going to be looking into that a little bit. And also that very relevant in this field, just wanted to highlight before we go through this, that marginalized identities are underrepresented in the mental health field. And that's something just to keep in mind as we go along and think about in terms of some of the reasons, just some more context, and also very, very relevant for when we start talking about how to go about improvements. So those are my little health warnings out of the way. If we can go to the next slide, and we can really get started in earnest. Okay, so when we talk about EDI, the word that usually sticks out is diversity. EDI is equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think what people, and especially from speaking with Hayley and meeting other groups like this and other organizations, the thing that people really, really push forward in their mind is diversity. And so I think it's always worth us having a little think about what we mean by that. You can see on the slides in the lovely orange box, what I say is an alternative word to be maybe variety. And what I mean by that is, especially as mental health professionals, especially as people who work with a very broad range of people, it is a common mistake to only think of one centralized, quote, normal identity and everybody else who doesn't fit into that little box as, quote, diverse. And that's a mistake. That's an understandable mistake, but it is a mistake. It's not accurate in terms of, and it's not helpful in terms of where we want to go with this. So if we think of diversity meaning difference, meaning that people from different backgrounds, different countries, different political perspectives, different relative classes, things like that, both intrinsic and internal and external based on more societal factors, that if you stack up 10 people, they'll all be different. So that's what we really want to keep in mind as we go through this. Obviously, we're going to talk about marginalized and non-marginalized identities, but really it's the marker of diversity is just that. It's variety, it's diversity, it's having not a homogenous kind of person. So next slide, please. Context. How did we get here? Now, something that I think is very important to have in our minds as we go through this is the way in which we relate to each other and the way in which we self-identify in 2022 is not inevitable and never was. And what do I mean by that? I think when people come and really reflect on, quote, diversity, like I've said, there is a focus now on marginalized versus non-marginalized identities, race, gender, sexuality, things like that. And we have, despite what our different perspectives on them are, whether and where we fit into that, we have quite clear thoughts and perceptions of the differences, that we draw quite bright lines in between ourselves, black, white, gay, straight, things like that. But something I want to highlight is that a lot of this is born of specific and often deliberate attempts to divide people. And I think of the easiest way and the clearest way to look at this is attitudes to race. So if we look at our modern attitudes, we are very clear about different races, clear delineations, certain ones treated better than others, right? And that's not necessary. And a lot of accepted wisdom is that that is just an inevitable part of being a human being, that being a human being means you have an element of tribalism, us versus them, and how people look is a pretty natural way of dividing between us. But actually, if you look at the academics behind this, and a big health warning in all of this, there are books and books and books and whole people's careers based on this. If you're interested, I can recommend some more and we'll send links, but this is just a whistle-stop tour. But broadly speaking, we can trace our modern attitudes to race to post-1500s, and more specifically, after the advent of the transatlantic slave trade. And why is that? That's because a certain set of people were deemed to be property that was able to be owned. And in order to justify that, they reverse engineered a lot of stereotypes, a lot of justifications for treating people in a certain way. And over time, those become entrenched, those become passed down generation after generation. And so a lot of the attitudes remain, even when the reasons that those attitudes came about have dropped away. And part of the reason for that is what I'll talk about in the next slide, which is social norms. So we go from having, one would say morally questionable reasons a lot of the time to for justification. So a lot of the reasons is, I want women to stay in the home, and therefore I'm going to create a lot of justifications for why that's correct. I'm going to say that I want Africans that we're bringing over to work and not be paid and be treated poorly, and that's fine because of X, Y, and Z. And you take those, repeat them enough, and then they get baked in. So in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, so the power of social norms. I also should have said that I have, as well as a legal background, a philosophical background. So this is what, this is born of a lot of philosophical reading. Social norms, to put it very broadly, are unwritten rules that people follow. So we're differentiating those from laws, traditional laws that you go and they get written down by Parliament and they're upheld by police, etc., etc. These are social rules that people follow based on where they're from and based on how the people before them and the people around them act. So on the screen, you can see a couple of examples of different sociological studies that talk about it. And I'm going to take the first, so I'm trying to be as quick as possible so we can get to therapy specific stuff and get through the context. So if you look at Maynard, 1952, this study was on miners in the South of America. And what it found was that in a mixed group of Black and white miners, when they were down the mine, they were far less interpersonally racist to each other than they were in the town. And they found the reason for this was, in the context of being down a mine, it was very important that there was a certain level of egalitarianism to make sure that everybody was able to survive. Whereas when they're in the town, in the restaurants, and it was segregated, and the social structural norm was inherited from a time when Black and white people weren't encouraged to bond because, as we've said, there was a financial motive to make sure they didn't, then those social norms won out. And those were these same people. It wasn't, somebody in the north, someone in the south, someone from China versus someone from Amsterdam. Those were the same people in the same town in different contexts. And the strength of the social norms based on the context radically changed their behavior. And it's the same in the contrast with Pettigrew, the same with people moving to Zimbabwe in the Rogers and France situation. And I'm sure also all of you attending this webinar will have examples of that, where you actively behave differently based on the social cues of the people around you. Those are the power, that's the power of social norms, that people tend to do what's expected of them. How is this relevant to what we're here to talk about? Well, how we identify ourselves and how we treat other people is based on a lot of different factors, but something that I think is really under-considered in this area is that power of social norms. Now, Barbara's going to talk about this a bit more when she talks about kind of hard therapeutic practice. But what's important to keep in mind is we are all the sum of our parts, and what we might not want to recognize as our inheritance is the sometimes outdated and sometimes just misguided views that we've held on from the past, and also the power of where we find ourselves and a human instinct to fit in. Now, whether that's a power dynamic with therapy, whether that's I'm the therapist and you're the client, and therefore I should be up here and you're down there, or vice versa. We all have pressures that we react to every day, And it's important, unless you really, really recognize it and challenge it if it's negative, that you can sort of sleepwalk through these dynamics. And as it says on the slide, the general rule is if you're not trying to be inclusive, you're probably not. And that's because, as we've said with the historical context, a lot of our opinions, a lot of our stereotypes are designed to keep a certain status quo where it is. So if you are just following the social norms, even if, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you think you're doing well, if you're not challenging, if you're not questioning, if you're not growing and changing, you are simply working to uphold a situation and a system that has already been set up in a very specific way. So next slide, please. So this brings us to something that I have labeled good person essentialism. And I think that this is especially important in helping professions. Like I said, my background is in the law. I'm a practicing lawyer and I have been for many, many years. And what I've observed is that it's sometimes easier for those of us who are in professions who aren't necessarily branded as positive to avoid good person essentialism. So what is that? Good person essentialism is the idea and the self-identification of someone or something or of yourself as good. And that's good versus bad. So when, and I'm sure a lot of you have this, again, helping professions, we want to think of ourselves as good. We want to think of ourselves, if we're, in the Western, we want to think of ourselves as wearing the white hat. And especially if you're doing a job that is helping other people, this is very, very, very tempting. And it's not just, but what it belies is the fact that people make mistakes, people get things wrong, people have bad days, people don't have all of the information, and people, like I said, are operating in a specific context, a specific time, in a specific place, and are taking their social cues from the people around them. And if you self-identify as a, quote, good person as opposed to a bad person, then what follows logically from that is good people do good things. And before you know it, you're in a situation where you might have made a mistake or done something accidentally offensive or done something ignorant. But because you self-identify as a good person, you have that boundary up from recognizing those mistakes and recognizing those issues. And so since your self-identification as a good person can't move, is immovable, what has to move is the definition of the things that you have done. So it goes from I've made a mistake as I'm a person, I'm a fallible person, to I'm a good person, and therefore what I do is good. And you see this, I'm sure a lot of you will be able to come up very easily with examples of people you know, or people, famous people, or whoever it is doing this. But what happens is, because being a good person is so embedded in how you view yourself and how you identify, it becomes almost impossible to let in anything that attacks that, because it becomes destabilizing. And you can see, so when people make mistakes, innocent or otherwise, they are mentally forcing themselves, backing themselves into a corner to say, these are the reasons why they're good, because I'm good and I only do good things. And so as we go on to the next part, I just want you to think about that and question whether you do it. And thanks, Amy, and think about the norms of therapy and mental health provision. Have you set up a dynamic, whether internally or organizationally, in which you are comfortable, and be honest with yourself, comfortable with admitting when you've done a bad thing, whether deliberately or not? So I'm going to pass over, I think, now to Barbara, so she can take you through the more specific therapy points. And I just want to thank you for, this can be a very heady topic. So I want to thank you for your patience, and I'm excited to hear from Barbara.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, hello, I'm Barbara, and I'm looking at the therapy itself. Now, that's a very, very broad topic. And so I thought, well, where do you start? Start at the beginning and start as you mean to go on. So you start with yourself. And that means that where possible, make sure that you know what your assumptions are about your client and their situation. Make sure that you've thought about it before you actually see them. And then when you've done that, make a deliberate, conscious effort to put your assumptions to one side beforehand. That's not always possible, but being conscious of your assumptions is half the battle. And think about where those assumptions come from. And of course, some of them have been highlighted by Kathryn before. Don't assume that you know best, because you may be an expert, but you're not necessarily an expert in your client's life. And things that make sense to you may not make sense to them as an individual. So that's one of the basic therapeutic principles. Another one is to build trust, because you don't have any intervention that can work at all if there isn't trust between you and, of course, your client. So, of course, trust is something that you can build, but it can take a long time, and it can also be a complex thing. But just about every single situation where there is trust, you will also find congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. It's also important to leave judgment at the door, and also finally to check that you're getting your message across. Okay, I'm going to look at these in a little more detail now. So please, can I have the next slide? Thank you. Well, the problems that I've highlighted are problems that have faced therapy for some time. So it's fair to say that things are a little better now, but there's still a way to go. And in the early days we're beset by mistakes, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you're working in almost any capacity whatsoever in the mental health field, there are some lessons that have already been learned regarding diversity. But one of the most important ones is that who the person is sitting in front of you is the person that you will relate to. And they will relate to you as well as you relating to them. They won't relate to an organization. So that's the important thing. So what did I actually mean by start as you mean to go on? Well, I talked about assumptions. Assumptions will be there with you in your session with your client, but also you will bring to that session your own culture, which is probably going to be the dominant culture. You'll bring with you your own views, your own judgments, the rules and expectations of the organization within which you are working. All of those will be in the room. And again, you need to think about this and how this will affect your client. To communicate effectively, as I said before, you need to carry your patient with you. And for that, you need trust. And I mentioned building it includes congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. Now, what congruence simply means honesty. So you have to be honest with your client. Empathy is different to sympathy. And what it means is that you have to try and think to yourself what it's like for your client. Firstly, in their lives, and secondly, what it's like for them sitting opposite you. Try to enter into their lives to see things from their perspective. And the unconditional positive regard is something that therapists find really, really difficult, because at the end of the day, you know, we don't like everyone, and we're not meant to like everyone. But the way around this is to dislike what the person does and not who they are as human beings. You can disagree with what they've done, but as I say, you don't dislike them as human beings, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So to go back a little bit, when I say leave judgment, you know, judgments at the door, you have to remember that your clients may fear, and I mean fear, that you'll judge them. And you'll judge them on superficials, maybe because they don't speak English very well. Maybe they speak English perfectly, but don't have much money. Maybe they're women, maybe they're from some marginalized group. So they may well have been on the receiving end of harsh judgments in the past. And as much as they may try, they may well be expecting that from you. And so they will come and sit opposite you really guarded. And however much you think that you may be hiding what you think about them, you probably aren't, and they pick it up. And this is where the leaving judgment at the door comes in, because even if they don't leave because of your harsh judgment or what they think is your harsh judgment, the quality of your intervention will suffer. And so one of the best things is to bring these things out into the open. If you feel that your client is going to be, feels that you're judging them, bring it out into the open and discuss it with them. That will go a long way to keeping them at their ease. The next thing is to try and see your client for who he or she really is. There is value in seeing the world from their perspective, because however much we try, we cannot see the world as our clients do. We see the world through our own filters, not through theirs. So when we try to step into their own shoes, then we're actually meeting them some way, because remember, your client isn't something that is just a recipient. They're active, they are people. And so they will, if you go halfway, they will usually try to meet you halfway as well. And so the fact is that that enables you to tailor your intervention or how you present it accordingly. And that makes it more likely to be received and acted upon by them. Now, what do you do if you have no knowledge of their culture? Well, you find out about it before the meeting. You can look at blogs, you can read books, you can talk to other people from that culture, you can watch films, watch things on programs on television. You can even ring an embassy, get in touch with an embassy, because embassies usually have a lot of information about their particular culture. So that when you go in and you're talking and you're with your client, it becomes clear very quickly that you know something about it. But don't try to pretend that you know all about their culture. That's just false. What you're showing them is that you're interested enough to find out and also ask them about it. They'll feel included. And instead of laying down the law, they'll feel that they're in a conversation with you, which is much, much better and, much more powerful when it comes to them understanding your intervention and actually working with it. You will have options, you'll have ideas about where the therapy should go or what would be best for your client, but then try to get them to discuss their solutions, and then your options and ideas become part of that. So there's a whole discussion about where they might be going, what might be helpful, what might not be helpful. And again, they will feel part of it. Now, all this is all very well, and it's very good when it works. But remember, as a therapist, you're a human being first. And sometimes you may not like the behavior of that person in front of you. And you may not be in a position where you can say, I dislike the behavior, but I'm okay with the person. If it really doesn't work for you, and I know this can be difficult, if it really doesn't work, remember, when you're building trust, the first one is honesty, congruence. So if you cannot work with this person, please pass them on to someone who can, because you are just deluding yourself, as I would be deluding myself and every other therapist would, if you think that you can actually actively dislike someone, but somehow you can do, sort of very good work with them based on trust and honesty. You can't do that. Okay. The last one here is also try not to dehumanize your client. And I say this not for the clients that most therapists would meet, but some therapists work in prisons and places where some people have done some truly terrible things, but they are working with them as therapists. And, and in a room, it's you as an individual working with another person as an individual. So it doesn't help if you're seeing that person as a monster. You always have to see them as the person that they are. And to do that, you go a long way to do that by starting as you mean to go on, building trust and leaving judgment at the door. Another point that is really good and does help is to acknowledge the realities of the situation at hand. Now, the reality is that you can't assume that you're both operating under the same framework. You're not. You have different ideas about how to live your life, and the other person may have different ideas and different experiences as how to live theirs, but you acknowledge that. And once you acknowledge it, then you start to be able to work with it. And it's also important to recognize that usually there's very little scope that you have to change an organization that you're not a part of. And sometimes even when you are a part of an organization, what you can change that your client is finding difficult about that organization is limited. But what you can change and what you can alter is how you see your client and how you work with them and how they work with you. And that can be enough to actually obviate the problems that your client is experiencing with the organization. Because remember, it's always individual to individual, person to person. That brings us on to power differentials. However well-meaning you are as a therapist, however committed you are to your client, it's never an equal relationship. We just think it is, and we do everything in our power to make sure it is sometimes, but it's not an equal relationship. And some clients that you work with will never have experienced any real power in their own lives, and they'll be terrified that you're judging them. They might feel, again, that you're judging them, or that maybe they have to behave in a particular way in order to get what they need, or they may feel that somehow they're not good enough, they don't add up to enough. And without your will, they inflate you. And so it's very easy for you to feel in that context, shall I say, intimations of superiority. That's why it's always important to bear this in mind. Also bear in mind that the reverse is true. Sometimes your client may not be from a subgroup, if you like, that's different from your own, but they're hardly marginalized. For example, you could be working with a lawyer, you could be working with a member of parliament. So it's highly unlikely that they're going to be marginalized. But the reverse here is true. You may feel de-skilled, especially if you're working, say, with a doctor. So it's always important to remember power differentials. And in that position where you're the one who might feel that somehow you are de-skilled, always remember that the doctor or the lawyer or that person sitting opposite you is just that, the person sitting opposite you, and is there so that you and they can come together to improve a situation. Always come back to that, because that will, again, it will ground you in situations where you feel that you're perhaps not quite grounded. So recognize the context and check in with yourself. Interventions that you will have learned to use in therapy have often historically been aimed at the majority culture, and all of the research has been aimed at that as well. So for example, in America, when a lot of work was being done on attachment theory back in the early days, they found that the mothers of marginalized groups, say Black mothers, Latino mothers, were being judged by not just how white mothers behaved, but how middle-class white mothers behaved. And so that was taken as the norm, and anything that below that was taken to be a deviation from the norm. It's a very quick journey from the word deviation to deviant, and so they found that a lot of children were being taken into care and split up because they had deviant mothers deviating from the norm. They also did not have the room, if you like, in their minds to actually see that there were different parenting styles. If a poorer mother had to do 3 jobs, she wasn't always there in the morning to give her children breakfast before they set off for school. However, she made sure that there were other relatives there who could, and the children didn't suffer. Now, this was a theory, but you will be using in your mind things like attachment theory when you are sitting opposite your client and working with your client. So it's always important to remember to have an idea that, what some of these things are based on. Now, it doesn't mean that you throw it all out, because that's not the case. A lot of it is very, very, very useful, but it's always important to look at and to think about what you're using and why. Something that will help you do that in the moment is how you're feeling. When you check in with yourself all through at different periods throughout the session and in different sessions, you just ask yourself, is there anything that you're missing? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel, a disquiet about something? Are you concerned about something? And it can be the other way as well. Are you disquiet because you're missing out steps, because the client that you have somehow fulfills some stereotypes that you have? So you just assume that your client knows various things, but they may not know them. And then you might get a warning, something that says to you, hang on, I'm not quite sure, is this quite right? So always always check in with yourself. Once you've done that, another thing to always do is engage with your clients and make sure that to make sure that you are getting the message across. So to get the message across, you don't have to work out how to do this. There are very good ways, tried and tested, that you can do. One of which is to summarize and reflect back what your client says to you. Because in order to do this, the client can then correct you if you've got something wrong, and they feel listened to, they feel heard, sometimes you can worry that you're interrupting your client, but it's not about interrupting, it's about reflecting back. And while you're doing it, that can also help your client to reflect on what they've said to you, which is really important. It also means that you will almost unconsciously engage active listening. You will be listening, but as you are listening to your client, you'll be taking in how your client is behaving towards what is being said. And even on Zoom, a lot of people say that on Zoom, you can't actually look at body language and things that you can face to face. And there is a certain amount of truth in that, but not nearly as much as people say. You can tell when somebody is pulling away from you, even on screen, or is leaning into what, you're actually saying. And it helps very much for your client to feel, just in your reflecting back, that you're reflecting their life, who they are, and you are actually empowering them in the sense of, well, yes, their identity is just fine. They're fine who they are. Because some people, as I said before, will come to you, they'll sit opposite you with that feeling that I'm less than. Simply by reflecting back and summarizing, you're saying, no, you're not less than. The other thing, of course, is to ask for feedback. If you really want to know how your message has landed, ask your client. And as you are building up your trust, as you're building up the therapeutic alliance, which is basically trust, and as your client comes to trust you more and more, they will tell you. And it's important when they tell you that they listen, and that you listen, and that you don't become defensive. Because if you ask for feedback, then the point is you must listen to it. And and some therapists think that it's a mark of failure that their clients have disagreed with them. Actually, it isn't. It's a mark of success in that your client feels comfortable enough and empowered enough and important enough that they can actually almost go toe-to-toe with you, not in an argumentative sense, but they can say to you, actually, I disagree with this. And that's a very important thing, because some of your clients, as I said before, won't have had any experience of being powerful at all. And so it may be their first experience of having their own voice heard. And that brings me on to intersectionality, and which I think in terms of which part of the person are you addressing? Now, if you think of internal family systems therapy by Janina Fisher, it's a whole idea that is gaining more and more traction as time goes on. And what that is, to summarize it outrageously, really, it's to say that a person is the sum of their parts, or more than the sum of their parts. We all have parts to us. And at any one time, you as a therapist will be talking to a part of that person. Now, if I give you a quick example of that, if your message, say, is for the vulnerable part of your client, and you need to speak to the vulnerable part of your client because you want to help them to realize that maybe they do have options and choices when maybe they don't have any, or that they are okay as a person. Now, that's the part of the person that you may need to actually speak to, but they may well have a long system, a whole tradition of jumping up and defending themselves angrily, because they may have learned that anger pushes you away, and that's the important thing to do. If you address that angry part all the time, and you're thinking in terms of just the anger, then you can lose your drift. And so what happens is that you never really get to contact the part of the person that you really need to contact. So maybe, you know, once you understand that, you need to help your client be putting their energy into the part of themselves that you need to speak to. I know it can sound quite complex, but it isn't really. And, you know, you need to get them to do that so that you are speaking to the part that you need to speak to, and not to the defense mechanism, say, that is actually going to prevent you from doing that. The reason you need to do that is that you will never, ever affect any change whatsoever without doing that, and without engaging the emotions that that part evokes in them. So in order to change someone, you need to, and that's when you both decide, you know, you decide that person in that area needs changing. It's never just cognitive, it's also emotional. You need to do the both to affect change. And so therefore, you need to speak to the part of the person that can actually make that change happen. Going back then in that same situation, thinking of you yourself as a therapist, sometimes if we're working with someone and we feel that we can't actually affect change, our message isn't getting across, what we do is quite often we will detach. And so there will be that void, if you like. And I don't mean bracketing, which is where you stand back so that you're not totally emotionally immersed in the thing, like you might be immersed in a story watching a film. You have to have part of you standing back so that you can make all of these changes and do all of the things that I've been talking about. But this isn't that. This is when you detach because you don't want to get hurt yourself. You know, it's de-skilling. It's something that feels very uncomfortable. We don't like it. We draw back, much the same way as you draw your hand away from a hob if you put your hand on the hob and it's hot. So just as you need to access that part of the person that can make change, you have to also make sure that you access the parts of yourself that can assist the person to do that. And you can't do that by detaching. So that's why self-care is really very, very important. It's extremely important, so that you're not tired, you're not overwhelmed, you're not in a position where you might feel de-skilled. Right, I could say a lot about that, but I'll leave that there for now. And one of the other things I would say, I've only got a couple more now, is when you ask your client to do something, and some therapies do ask you to give homework and whatever, never ask them to do something that they can't do. Now, this may seem obvious, but for a lot of people it's not, because you may feel, what if they can't do it? It's okay, we'll do it next time in when we have a session next time. But failure builds walls. And if your client feels that they have failed in that, remember, they may feel that they failed in their lives. Therapy is something else they're going to fail at in their own minds. Eventually they won't come. And so nothing, can be done. So the last thing that I will talk about is trauma. Now, a whole books have been written about trauma, and we were asked to include a little bit about it. But what I will say, and I'll only say something small, is that people can be very concerned, therapists, I mean, whether a client's trauma is organizational, i.e. due to interacting with an organization that may marginalize them. It may be racist. There may be all sorts of problems. It may take away their power, depersonalize them, all of those things, and they may be traumatized because of it. Or is my client traumatized because of an individual event? Did they have someone die? Was it, were they involved in an accident? I would say that in many ways it doesn't matter, because the person sitting in front of you, if they are traumatized, they are traumatized. And so you work with trauma. As I said earlier on, you cannot change the organizations that they interact with. You can, have some hope of changing your own, but inside your therapy room, where you are working with your therapy, you can make sure that the difficulties that they've experienced with other organizations, i.e. powerlessness, for an example, they don't experience it with you. And you can then work in a traumatized way with your client who has trauma. If you do that, then you'll find you're working with them, and as difficult as trauma is, you will be gently removing the walls between you rather than unconsciously reinforcing them. Okay, so those are the things that I think that I use these things, I do them myself, and I do them all the time, so I know that they work. And as therapists, we want to do things that work. So I'll finish with this section now and pass back to Kathryn. And if you have any questions, then maybe we'll be able to take them at the end. Okay, then. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was fantastic. I've done some great comments in the chat. Yeah, so I will blitz through this last part just so we can have some time for questions. So leading on from what Barbara said, so you can see there we're talking about avoiding the trap of good person essentialism. I won't go into this too much, because I think Barbara's covered a lot of this. What I will say is recognize that we all privilege our own perspectives. That's normal, that's natural, but you have to remember we're not perfect. You need to recognize when you need some learning, recognize when mistakes are made, recognize when you might not be the right person, the correct person in the situation, and keep an open mind that you could be in the wrong. And if you have that mindset, you have that open mindset, you're very prepared to review yourself and review your attitudes and put into practice all of those things that Barbara went through. Next slide, please. So yes, I won't go too much into this. It's just something, if we'd had time, I would have gone into a bit more. But obviously the other side of having an open and practical therapeutic environment for your clients, your patients, whoever, and also for your employees, is making sure that not only are the individual therapists or you yourselves open and aware, but also that your organization is. So if you're a leader in your organization, or you have the ear of them, or if you're, wherever you work, and you can try and foster these attitudes. So these are some rules that we can go through. I won't go through them too much, but accept that there's a problem, set priorities, and that means putting something behind it with accountability, budget, things like that, reviews, analyze, and this is an important one. A lot of people are trying to have improvements in a vacuum, so it helps to have data to kind of keep track of who's going to see you, if they're leaving, why they're leaving, not just quantitative data, but also qualitative. Encourage a feedback positive environment, like Barbara said so eloquently. Having even negative feedback can be very, very positive. And then also from the employee point of view, or the volunteer point of view, have an open environment so that the organization itself can be critiqued. And I put on the slide the 4 Ds of intervention in case any actual incidents come up. So they're there for you to have a look at. And if you are a leader in an organization, it can help for you to turn up and make your presence felt. No one's saying that you need to center yourself in a situation, but to have the head of an organization or the trustees or directors, whoever it might be, present at meetings aimed towards diversification, support, intergroup dynamics, education, that's a very powerful signifier that these are actually principles that you're not just paying lip service to and that you actually care about. And again, the theme of this presentation, arguably, question your practices on an individual and an organizational basis. There's always room for an improvement, and you won't know what you need to improve unless you're doing that function of questioning, of getting that feedback, of review. And I think we've got one last thing, so we can just take you through the main points of this. So in the next slide, yes. So review of techniques, so we have it all in one place. So review your own behavior, take the tests. On a later slide, so a good place to start. It can, I find, speak to people about questioning their own biases and stereotyping. It can be, a deep well to look down. There's the Harvard implicit bias test that I always recommend as a very good place to start. There's a link, you can go on their website and you can take tests designed to expose the implicit biases that you might have. And they have a broad range of them. So I think it's always worth kind of doing the whole gamut. Engage with cultures you're coming across, as Barbara said, speak openly, open dialogue, open to being wrong and to improving, reach out to organizations who want to educate you. I'm sure some of you are actually working at organizations that do this really important work, but there are also just, for every identity, there will be someone. Address institutional issues, hire diverse therapists, as we said right at the beginning of this, part of improving this area, this sector, the industry, is diversifying the people in it. Be clear when you need to go and get help. You won't be able to do everything, and it's important to be able to be honest enough that you can do that. And as Barbara said, read Janina Fisher. She has some really, really interesting writing in this topic. And I think from there, we don't have much time left. We can say, I think Barbara might have to drop off, but quite on time, but we can have some questions if there are any.
Kathryn, hi, Hayley here. Just coming back in to say that was fantastic from both of you. Thank you so much. I know I have popped in the chat box, just if anyone does have any questions, either raise your hand or type them up for us, that would be most welcome. But equally, I think there's great value in us on the programme working with you offline about how we can replicate and get greater access to your knowledge and resource in your organisation, because some of that information, at least for myself, whom it's less pertinent to, will be ruminating around my head for a good couple of days. So we do understand if you haven't got any questions, and of course if you have a 4 o'clock. I'm going to stop sharing and just see something has come in. Turn my video on so you have something. It's just a comment from Alison. Thank you so much. Very practically useful. Look forward to the slides to share with the team. So yes, what we'll be doing is the session's been recorded, so we'll make sure that that gets its way to those that have registered. And as I say, I think I'd be keen to see how Barbara and Kathryn's perspectives could be lent further into the programme to deepen, I suppose, your EDI practice and considerations and those individual and organisational reflections. I think some people might either restart or start afresh following today. I don't know, since we've not had any questions come through, I don't know if Kathryn or Barbara, either of you would like to wrap up or leave us with a final note, and then we'll close out the, I think there is one.
Yeah, so I'll do that because I think it's almost 4, so I know Barbara probably needs to drop off now. So just 2 things. So we can circulate slides at the the last slide actually has a kind of set of links that I think would be helpful also for further reading and things like that. So the question from Alison, anything you can do to influence counselling training institutions to diversify intake would be great. Yeah, so that's a question I get a lot. Hang on, I'll put myself on video if I can. No, hang on. Yes, here I am. Yeah, so a lot of it is, like Barbara was saying a lot through there, a lot of it is repetition, respect, and visibility in my experience. I've done a lot of work in the legal profession and also as a consultant for other professions, including obviously mental health, going through this. And I think there's a lot of very practical things that you can do, and that's, you know, go to people, find organizations, speak to, especially if you have university groups, for example, is a classic one. You can talk to networks, put yourself in front of people that you wouldn't necessarily automatically do. That's definitely part of it. But I think also sometimes people overthink it, and they think, as we were talking about with identity, it's very relevant that a lot of the time people find themselves to be one way, and they assume that people who aren't exactly the same are very, very different, when actually I think you'll probably find that a lot of people who want to work in the mental health profession as a counsellor, psychotherapist, whatever, have quite similar reasons for doing so actually. And making sure that there's an inclusive environment, and not just in terms of, look, we have these diversity quotas and isn't it great, but in terms of when you're going to see people, when people are making inquiries, when people are talking about what it actually entails, having that little extra bit of knowledge and extra bit of time, and for lack of a better term, sort of emotional openness and emotional closeness that you can actually use to, once people inquire, they'll actually want to go through the door. Because something I hear a lot is people having a great idea and then going and making their inquiries and talking to people and then getting a brick wall and thinking, oh, that's not the place for me, because they couldn't even have a conversation with me for half an hour and make me feel like a human being. And the truth is, and whether it's sad or not, I'll leave it to yourself, people who are from marginalized backgrounds, by the time they're at that point, are pretty used to being the only one of them in a room. And so anything that you can do to make them feel more open is great, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. They want to go in, they want to work and learn and be as good as they can be, just like everybody else. And like Barbara said, a part of that piece is getting feedback. If you meet someone you think they're great and then they didn't apply, you can reach out and ask them why. The worst that can happen is that they ask you to leave them alone, and then you'll do that. But sorry, yeah, that's a long response. But
no, that's a really good, great, thorough answer to the question. We've an additional one in amongst all the thanks that have come in from Meg. I run an anonymous student-led listening and information service, London Nightline. We often wonder how we can ensure that all students, regardless of their identity, can feel confident when contacting us that we are a service for them. Do you think that putting information on the website or social media about our volunteer demographics is useful, or any other suggestions?
I think it can be, yeah. I don't know what your demographics are. Obviously, if they look a certain way and you think it might be off-putting for people, then that's a decision to come to as a group. But I tend to think, and maybe this is my lawyer coming through, shining through, as it so often does, but I tend to say, if you want to communicate a point, communicate that point. And there are lots of different sort of intuitive ways that you can make it clear that you're welcoming to other people, but a very easy way is to say, we are welcome to everybody. We welcome everyone, because you'd be surprised. A lot of people, oh yeah, okay, so that's a very diverse group. You can say you're open to everybody. You can say your background, you can say your breakdown, that's very positive, and you can say what your values are and things like that, and just be as clear as possible to show that your hearts are in the right place, and you also have the facilities to deal with a broad range of people, because it sounds like you do. But yeah, there's, like I said, there's a certain amount of reinventing the wheel in this area, and that's fantastic. There are so many different ways. Every little helps, as the adverts go. But just clearly stating things very, very undervalued in this space.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thanks. Meg said very useful. Thank you. Okay, fantastic. So for those of you that have stayed with us just for those few minutes, so that those questions could be answered live, much appreciated. I haven't received anything further, as I say, other than glowing thanks. Lots of people saying it's coming at the right time. So informative, really interesting, really interesting. So this is a brilliant, really happy note for us to end on. As I say, we'll work with Quartz and Kathryn and Barbara to redistribute the slides and the recording and things like that in due course. And I suppose watch this space. I'm sure I mean, we spoke just before we came on about, a lot of this work we'll be able to see, Barbara and I were speaking, we'll be able to see impacts in weeks, but more likely months from providers who say, as a result of just one piece of learning through this webinar, plus this and this and this that I packaged it up into, we are now doing this and have seen these changes. So I'm sure we'll kind of I always greatly receive those messages. So as and when you make those leaps and bounds, please do get in contact. And I suppose then it's all just to extend my thanks to Kathryn and Barbara, who I think left on time, totally fine. It's really fantastic session, and very much look forward to working with the two of you going forward.